When I came to America in the late 1970s, as I became familiar with American politics, it took me a while to do that, three issues stood out. And it seems like the country was in trouble in three distinct areas: inflation, crime, and illegal immigration. And I mention this because you have a feeling of deja vu now in America. You have a Democrat in the White House. At that time, it was Jimmy Carter. Now it's Biden. You had a Democratic Congress, as we have now. And we're seeing a surge in all these three problems: a surge in inflation, a surge in crime, and a surge in illegal immigration. Now, of course, the main difference is that the surge now is occurring in the wake of lessons that should have been learned from dealing with those problems over the past few decades, because crime was curbed in America, inflation was brought under control, illegal immigration was, well, not stopped, but you may say arrested, slowed down, brought to somewhat manageable levels, certainly under Trump. And so what you have is that in these areas, the Democrats are pushing forward as if it was the 70s all over again, as if they never knew how to deal with these problems. I mean, Carter certainly didn't know. He listening to Carter talk about inflation, you felt like you were on another planet. The man had no clue about what to do about it. In fact, his remedy was simply to diagnose the American people as suffering from some kind of malaise. But after Carter, when Reagan came in, along with a head of the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, who was a Democrat, but Reagan nominated him to continue his term, Reagan and Volcker worked together to sort of tighten the money supply and squeeze inflation out of the economy. It was admittedly a painful remedy, but that's how you cure it. And the lesson of the Reagan years was don't let inflation rear its ugly head again. But here we are. The Consumer Price Index for June rose 5.4%. That shows you inflation isn't just here, it's accelerating. The Fed has tried to keep inflation around 2%. At one point, Janet Yellen, the former Fed chairwoman, now Treasury Secretary, said, hey, you know what? These are temporary adjustments to COVID, but we're getting the idea that they're not so temporary. Inflation is here to stay. It's kind of feeding on itself. Let's turn to crime. We've seen a surge in crime in all these cities. I just talked about that a few moments ago. And the national average is thus pushed up dramatically. 25% increase in homicides in the calendar year 2020. We're on track to outpace that this year in 2021. And by the way, that's the highest since 1960. So a real spike in crime. And yet, there's a lesson to be learned, which is to say in the 1980s, but continuing in the 90s, first Rudy Giuliani, and then under Bloomberg, under Police Chief Bill Bratton, New York showed a recipe of how to fight crime. You fight it at all levels. And other cities picked up the New York formula, and that's how we saw a decline in crime. And by the way, this benefited disproportionately black neighborhoods. You could go into New York, when I lived in New York around 2000, from 2010 to 2012, you could go to Harlem, you could go to Brooklyn, you could go to neighborhoods that were once very dangerous, almost uninhabitable in the 70s, but they were completely safe, they were gentrified, there were shops, there's Starbucks, there are bookstores, there are restaurants, and all of this is now kind of going back to the way it was, which is to say, emboldening the criminal and endangering the black and Latino inhabitants of those areas. And then illegal immigration. Illegal immigration was curbed under Trump. But apparently Biden thinks it's a really good idea to have 1 to 2 illegal 1 to 2 million illegal immigrants swarming into the United States. And these are COVID infected. There are people who are, there are cartels involved. There are violent gangs involved, MS-13 and so on. Why would this be a good idea for the United States? And by the way, the Biden administration is doing this while turning away distressed Cubans who are fleeing genuine political persecution, who legitimately qualify as refugees. They're being sent home while all kinds of people, by the way, not just Mexicans, but Haitians and Asian Orientals and Chinese are showing up at the Mexican border, and they're all being let in. Yeah, here's the gate, walk right through. Sign up for a court date. Ha 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 ha. We know you're not going to show up, but there you are. You're now in the United States. So we're watching this wretched movie play out a second time. And the disgusting thing is that the last time the Democrats arguably didn't know, this time they do know, and they're still doing it.